Hello, and welcome back to your daily installment of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. Today we're talking about 2 Samuel chapter 1 through 4. And tomorrow we're going to be digging into some more Psalms. So tomorrow we're doing Psalm 6, 8, 9, 10, 14, 16, 19, and 21. Bunches of Psalms for tomorrow, but for today is 2 Samuel, and let's dig into it. So, the second book of Samuel, of course, it all used to be one book, but they split it into two. And nobody really knows the author, but most scholars believe that the prophets Nathan and Gad had significant input into this composition. Now, 2 Samuel was written sometime about the reign of King David. That was around 1010 to 970 BC is the time frame that most people believe it was written. But it could have been written during Solomon's reign about 950 BC. The big picture here about the second book of Samuel is David's reign over Israel. And it included times of elation, such as his conquest of Jerusalem and the Lord's promise of an everlasting dynasty, as well as times of failure, such as his adultery with Bathsheba and the treason of his son Absalom. Now, in summary, 2 Samuel has three clear sections. David's triumphs are essentially chapters 1 through 10. Then David's transgressions during chapter 11 are the next section. And the third section is David's troubles from chapter 12 through 24. And as we start today with chapter 1 through 4, these chapters describe the struggle for Israel's throne that began with Saul's death. And a little food for thought before we dig into the scripture. David's rule testified to the amazing works of the Lord. And those amazing works that the Lord could and would do through a life that is yielded to him. Israel's second king seemed quite aware of God's blessing on his life and displayed a tender heart toward the things of God. However, the consequences of David's sin with Bathsheba stand as a warning to all who experience sin's attraction. God holds his children accountable for their actions, and even forgiven sin can have terrible consequences. Now, I noticed two big things in chapter 1 through 4, and I'll mention them as we get to talking about it. Right at the beginning, we're going to talk about the history, a little bit of it. The historical account of the first kings of Israel continues following the description of the death of Saul here. That was, we talked about in 1 Samuel 31. No doubt David and his men needed some rest, so of course here they decided to stay at Ziklag. Now, in addition, Ziklag, if you remember, still needed to be rebuilt from 1 Samuel chapter 30, where it was all destroyed. Now, by the third day there, Saul had been dead a few days, but David had been occupied elsewhere. Now we see in here written torn clothes and dust on his head. Those were signs of mourning, so David immediately knew bad news was coming. And here's the Amalekite story. This story was pretty interesting, and this was one of the two things I wanted to point out here. Now, Mount Gilboa was the site of the battle, so that was where Saul died. So the messenger's word places him at the scene. Saul, leaning on his spear, gives the sense that he was possibly an eyewitness, was speaking here. The mention of the chariots and the cavalry, of course, was consistent with the Philistines' warfare style, especially in a valley where the chariots had plenty of room to maneuver. Now, ironically, the man here was an Amalekite, part of the group that Saul had been commanded to destroy. Saul's alleged words here could square with the circumstance of 1 Samuel chapter 31, verse 3 through 4, with his words, I stood over him and killed him. The Amalekite claimed responsibility for killing Saul. That's not exactly what we read in that story. Further, the man's possession of Saul's crown and armband provided proof of the Amalekite's presence at Gilboa, and that Saul was dead. Now, two possibilities exist on harmonizing this verse with 1 Samuel chapter 31, verse 4. The first is to assume that Saul fell on his sword, but did not die immediately. and so asked the Amalekite to help bring about a quicker death. The second idea, and more likely in my opinion, is that the Amalekite arrived on the scene after Saul had died and fell on his own sword, but before the Philistines arrived, and he saw an opportunity to receive a reward from David. So he took the crown and the armband to David and lied about the way that Saul died. Now perhaps David detected the Amalekite's deceit, in which part would explain his command in verse 15 after hearing this story from the Amalekite. Verse 15, David summoned one of his servants and said, "Come here and kill him." The servant struck him and he died. So that's the end of it. I did find it interesting that the book of Joshua was mentioned here again. It was mentioned in Joshua chapter 10 verse 13, and it's never been discovered, but it appears to have been a collection of some of God's great works among his people. Verses 19 through 27 show that. Now we move on, and I'm going to bust forward to chapter 3. I have a picture here of a couple of brothers, one in blue, one in gray. Actually, they ain't really brothers. One of them's Custer, but regardless, this is just a depiction of civil war. Civil war, brother against brother. These are both Americans who are fighting against each other for similar purposes. And of course, here's a depiction of some actors reenacting the Civil War as we talk through this. Who's on whose side? As we get through chapter 2 and 3, it becomes extremely confusing to find out who's on whose side. We've got Israelites killing Israelites for the sake of the fact that they had killed other Israelites. And the eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth thing is blown up pretty big here. Now, and the same thing happens here with Abner. We get to verse 12 of chapter 3. Abner, he wants to make a covenant with David, and David said, "Sure, I'll make a covenant with you. However, there's one thing I require of you. You will not see my face until you bring Saul's daughter, Michal, when you come to see me." Now, Saul's daughter, Michal, if you recall, was David's first wife, who Saul took away and gave to Paltiel, the son of Laish, after David became a fugitive. By getting her back, David would reestablish himself as a legitimate relative and heir to Saul's throne. So there was a method to this madness. David had never divorced Michal either, so technically she rightly belonged with him and not Paltiel. But again, there's perspective on that would say otherwise. Someone would say, no, that's not true. In verse 16, her husband followed her, weeping all the way to Bahurim. Abner said to him, "Go back." So he went back. So clearly, Paltiel's husband loved her. Paltiel's wife. Paltiel loved Michal. Paltiel was Michal's husband. Now, of several years they've been together through all these battles and wars. It's been years. And perhaps the ones who suffered the most was Paltiel in this situation. Along with Michal, she possibly loved him as well. And Bahurim was located near the Benjamin-Judah border. Abner was probably an imposing military man, so when he bluntly told Paltiel to go back, Paltiel was intimidated into obeying, despite his broken heart. Now, Abner was ready to coordinate final plans among the northern tribes to gather all of Israel together, and that's when things went kind of awry. Joab stabbed him in the stomach, just as Abner had done to Asahel, which was Joab's brother. So this was another one of those eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You killed my brother, so now I'm killing you. There was a funeral and everything, a big public display, and David's public participation in Abner's stately funeral would further distance him from blame for Abner's death. The king wept aloud. This is something that kings normally did not do. So this is more proof that he was innocent. And then we get into once the news of Abner's death reached Ishbosheth, he just gave up. He was one of the other guys that was against him, and he just gave up and had lost his strongest general. So here's a little insight on that. Rechab and Baanah, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, set out and arrived at Ishbosheth's house during the heat of the day while the king was taking his midday nap. They entered the interior of the house as if to get wheat and stabbed him in the stomach. They killed him, essentially, and then they escaped. But they removed his head. They cut it off, and they brought the head to David. Now, here's the head of your enemy, is what they told David, essentially. But David answered them in a similar way that he answered before. He gave orders that the young man be killed. Instead of rewarding him, they killed him. Kind of like he did the Amalekite in the first chapter, right? So David was not a big proponent, it seems, of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth here. He was clearly saying another wrong does not make it right. Two wrongs don't make it right. So David gave the orders to the young men, and they killed Rechab and Baanah for what they had done. But then they took Ishbosheth's head and buried it in Abner's tomb in Hebron. And that is it for today. I hope this has touched you. We'll see you again tomorrow for a whole bunch of Psalms. And we will see you then. Peace out.